Even as the stakes for succeeding in education get higher and higher every year, we're still choosing a mode of teaching that we know only works well for a minority of our children, and it's killing us. It's time to start talking about the most revolutionary option on the table: unleashing our superpower.
Nothing, absolutely nothing, approaches the effectiveness of tutoring.
Tutoring's unlike most educational approaches in that we have a lot of good research on its effectiveness.
Tutoring, lots and lots of tutoring. That is going to put them way, way ahead.
Welcome to Tutoring the Human Superpower. I'm Giles Lieber. The next episode after this one is going to be about the cost of tutoring. A lot of people have been asking me about that. It's a valid concern to have. And I've thought a lot about it, and I think I have some really good news to share. But in my nerdy way, I will be discussing the costs of a tutoring movement in the historical context. How much did the common schools movement cost? How about the high school movement a century later? How did we find the money for those? And how much might a third century of educational movements compare? But before I come to that, I have a guest whose research can allow us to zoom way out, even further, for a bigger picture perspective on the cost of education. It was really an honor to have a chance to speak with an education anthropologist and psychologist, Professor Sheina Lew-Levy. Her research, along with her colleagues, of course, shows that humans have been grappling with the cost of education, not for hundreds of years, not for thousands of years, but for hundreds of thousands of years, maybe millions even. In fact, the cost of education has been such an important part of the human story that it is not just a modern political issue, it's an ancient evolutionary issue. It's not just embedded in our tax codes, it's in your code. It's in your DNA. I think some of us can take education lightly and even resent it because the word education itself makes us picture modern day westernized schools with classrooms, and we might even picture all the political fights over what goes on in those classrooms. But this is wrong. As long as we mistake schooling for education, it's easy to underestimate the importance of education to our past and our future. Drawing on Dr. Sheina Lew-Levy's perspective can allow us to put all that baggage aside and get to the core of what education and teaching is really all about and what it really costs. Dr. Sheina Lew-Levy is an assistant professor of psychology in Durham University in the UK, and she's co-director of Durham's Cultural Evolution Research Center. She and her colleagues study the teaching and learning patterns among people who even still today live in the hunter-gatherer or forager lifestyle of our ancestors. A lot of her work has focused on the Bayaka people. They are a nomadic forager group living in the region of Central Africa. She speaks their language and has spent many hours and days observing their educational practices. I spoke to her initially because her definition for costly teaching, as she's going to describe in the interview, is so similar to my definition for tutoring. But the interview ended up being more profound and more transformative than what I initially bargained for, and that will become clear at the end of the interview when I do my 2 cents. Her research has really transformed my thinking, and I hope that you will find it as interesting as I do. Welcome, and thank you for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
So in the spring of 2022, you were the lead author on a study called Costly Teaching Contributes to the Acquisition of Spear Hunting Skill Among Bayaka Forager Adolescents. You opened this article with a statement that I think could be unpacked for an hour by itself. Teaching likely evolved in humans to facilitate the faithful transmission of complex tasks. So, first of all, what is teaching? I think that a long time ago, or maybe not that long ago, people didn't think that there was teaching that took place in communities like the Bayaka, right?
Absolutely. So there were a lot of debates about what teaching even is. And cultural anthropologists and psychologists, which I think you're referring to in this context, they focus more on the institution of teaching and specifically what happens in very structured contexts in schools, but also in rites of passage that would happen in diverse communities around the world. And so they've made the point that we don't need classrooms for people to acquire knowledge. And that really is an important statement, because in an overemphasis to get butts in the seat and get kids into classroom, we tend to actually devalue the type of learning that kids are doing outside of the classroom. That's actually really central to their development and to their well-being within the kind of cultural communities that they're part of. But that said, of course, teaching is on a spectrum, and it can happen at these really micro scales and at these very structural political scales. And when we think of it as a spectrum, we find that teaching occurs in every single human society around the world, and even in some animals, like meerkats taking the stingers off of scorpions so that their offspring can practice hunting without taking the risk of getting stung. So that would be an ethological or a behavioral definition of teaching, something costly to yourself to benefit learning in another individual. And when you apply that definition, everybody teaches.
Did you catch that? I asked because I have to admit that during the interview, I missed it. But this is the definition of teaching, and it's important. To anthropologists, teaching is something costly you do for somebody else's learning. At its core, that's what teaching is. If you're doing something that is costly to you to benefit learning in another individual, you're teaching. And when she says costly, she's not talking about money.
It's important to recognize that teaching also comes at a cost, right? So imitation, the good thing about imitation, there's only one person involved in terms of like expending energy for learning. It's just the learner. They're paying attention to what's happening in their environment, doing what they do. They're imitating. Once you bring teaching into it, there's imitation, but also guidance. So you have person A teaching, person B learning. So that's twice the energy, plus they're coordinating their behavior. So it adds an element of energy expenditure.
So you also said teaching likely evolved. What do you mean by teaching likely evolved?
Yeah, so in human cultures, we tend to think of cultures as very opaque, kind of complex thing when we think of religious ceremonies or making complex technology. And so it's not straightforward to actually learn those types of behaviors. And so humans have evolved loads of different mechanisms, not only teaching. One is over imitation. And then related to that is teaching, which actually involves somebody else giving you hints and cues of what you should pay attention to so that your attention is drawn to the elements that matter. For example, when you're trying to build a computer or make a bow. And so by having a teacher tell you, this is how it works and this is how it comes together, you can get those steps much quicker and much more efficiently. The ability to recognize that somebody else has a knowledge gap and to fill it. And so that's from the point of view of the teacher. And then from the point of view of the learner, the ability to pay attention to really subtle cues like eye contact, like pointing, like things that are really, really subtle to be able to know, okay, now I should be paying attention to that thing. So the joint eye gazing that develops around 9 months, like if the caregiver is looking at something and the kid is looking at something, right? That's really subtle and involves so much kind of cognitive hardware to be able to know that person's looking at something, I should look in the same direction of that person because there's something of interest going on. So those two things for sure go hand in hand.
The two things that go hand in hand are the simple ideas that we are both biologically wired to become good at teaching and also good at learning from teachers. Teaching and learning from other humans is not just some cultural invention. It's innate. Just like it's in your DNA to become somebody who can speak and understand another person who is speaking, it's also in your DNA to become a good teacher and good at learning from teaching. To be clear, it's not in your DNA to become good at classroom management and lesson planning and keeping a group of 20 second graders engaged. That takes skills that are not innate. The kind of teaching that it is in your DNA to become good at is the kind that involves mind reading and theory of mind and scaffolding. Tutoring. Okay, so then the sentence continues, teaching likely evolved to facilitate the faithful transmission of complex tasks. What does faithful transmission mean?
Yeah, so any type of learning can involve error, right? If you think of a math problem, it's easy to make an error when you're doing a complex division or something like that. When we talk about faithful transmission, we're talking about reducing the likelihood that you'll make an error. So, again, if we're talking about complex technology or things that are life and death, right? Like identifying a venomous snake versus a non venomous snake, it's really important to get those things right.
Teaching likely evolved in humans to facilitate the faithful transmission of complex tasks. And complex tasks are basically tasks that are too challenging to learn from just imitation or figuring things out on your own. That's the original purpose of education. Most of the loftiest goals we have for education, things like being a good citizen in a democracy, functioning in the job market and being productive, being socially and emotionally skilled, just about anything that you could ever name in a school's mission, really just kind of boils down to complex tasks that we educators want to empower future generations to become skilled with. Faithful transmission. Okay, but that was still just the first sentence of her study. By studying the teaching and learning patterns among the Buyaka foragers, Sheina discovered a pattern that affirms the definition and purpose of education, but also adds a whole new dimension. Not all teaching is equally costly. So when and why does the cost of teaching go up or down among foragers? In prior research, Sheina had followed children as they went about their daily lives, and she and her team observed children learning a lot of their subsistence skills from older children, actively teaching them. But Sheina did not see children teaching each other one of the most important subsistence skills of all, spear hunting. None. Which was very surprising. If she wasn't seeing kids teaching other kids to spear hunt, how were they learning? She reasoned that spear hunting skills might be too complex to learn from other kids. So maybe they were learning spear hunting from experienced adults only. She had never witnessed that kind of learning in action because she'd never been on a hunt. It was fine for her to follow children around when they were gathering caterpillars or fruits, but she couldn't follow them spear hunting without risking ruining the hunt from her lack of experience.
So that was kind of the idea behind using the GoPro cameras, was to be able to capture these behaviors without actually being there myself. So we asked these teenage boys to tell us who they wanted to learn to spear hunt from, and all of them nominated adults, which was not a constraint that we placed on it. Who they nominated were people they felt comfortable with and who they had access to. We could see a scenario in which everybody nominated one amazing hunter who would never have the time to teach them, but that's not at all what happened in the study. Because most adults are good spear hunters, the knowledge was well enough distributed within the community that there wasn't necessarily individuals who rose to the top. And then we asked somebody who was on their list, mostly the first person on their list, to take them spear hunting. And we fitted both the teacher and the learner with GoPro cameras.
So what did you learn from the GoPro cameras?
Yeah, so we learned that, especially when we compared to the types of teaching that we observed in other studies that were more generally focused, that teachers were using much more time consuming and cognitively consuming forms of teaching, and specifically instruction. So really telling somebody how to do something verbally, and demonstration, showing adolescents how they should be spear hunting. And we also saw loads of really fun things, like play acting was a big part of it, going out in the bushes and rustling the bushes and then pretending and, mimicking the cooperative nature of hunting, talking about the weather and kind of finding their way through the forest, setting up targets for learners and making them practice. So it was really time-consuming stuff. It was naturalistic behaviors in the sense that even though it wasn't when they would be performing the behaviors, they would be performing those behaviors when teaching spear hunting more generally.
All right, it's not like they
Or faking.
a blank slate of
Exactly.
teaching skills and then invented all of those immediately on the spot for Sheina.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
I noticed that you didn't structure the study to have, for example, 6 kids going out with one hunter. Is there a reason that you did one-to-one there?
Yeah, so we did one-to-one there because that's how Buyaka themselves would go out in dyads or triads to spear hunt, unless they were going out to hunt for pigs, which would be a bigger group, but you would still only get 1 or 2 learners in that context.
And this is rare, right? Are there any other domains where you would see those kinds of things being used?
Yeah, so we see it in terms of rites of passages. It tends to
Okay.
be a time of life across cultures where there's very kind of concerted effort in teaching religious knowledge, ceremonial knowledge.
Okay.
And we see it in terms of costly skills related to shamanism. Those
Yeah.
also tend to involve a one-to-one initiated one-to-one teaching because it's obviously very important to get those skills right. And I think we could see it, I haven't studied this yet, but in the domain of medicinal plants, especially some that have to be prepared in very careful ways. So again, overlapping with shamanism and also in terms of caring for very young infants where you want to get that right. So in those domains, that
Uh-huh.
type of complex skill, then again, you get really costly forms of teaching.
As the title of the study implies, its big conclusion was that the greater complexity of spear hunting caused the cost of education for spear hunting to go up. It was no longer simple sentences, quick gestures, and short explanations. It was extended instruction sessions, practice, demonstration, coaching. And it was no longer a child who was teaching. For spear hunting, it had to be an adult in their prime. A pillar of the society was using their precious time and energy to teach. And even then, not teach a whole bunch of kids at once, but just one or two kids at a time. Tutoring. It's hard to get costlier than that. And so maybe that's why tutoring became our superpower. Maybe evolution favored those who were good at tutoring and being tutored, and had an interest in doing both. So the last sentence also was interesting, where you were saying this raises the possibility that some of our skills that are so special to humans, including language, I suppose, may have co-evolved with hunting with spears, because we have evidence of humans hunting with spears back to 300,000 years ago, which I think is even pre-Homo sapien. Can you explain the idea that we co-evolved with this
Yeah.
complexity?
So my colleague Anna-Mika Milks, who's also on this paper, she's an archaeologist who studies spears and spear hunting, and she makes this fantastic point that spears may be easier to make than bows and arrows, but they're not easier to use. So
Mm.
you actually need to have a lot of complex knowledge to be able to hunt with a spear, mostly because you have to be pretty close. I mean, you can throw a spear pretty
Oh.
far, but certainly not as far as a bow and arrow.
Mhm.
And, once we're talking about using poison, as many people would do with bows and arrows, and that again, like you don't have to hit them that hard with a bow and arrow.
Right.
With the spear, especially in the Congo Basin where it's a forested environment, you have to be really close to an animal. And so to be able to do that, you need to be an amazing tracker. You need to know bird language to be able to know how species are moving in space. You need to know about the ecology and where you're most likely to find species. So there's just so much knowledge involved in this hunting skill, like beyond, not to mention the religious ceremonies associated with hunting luck, which are also very, very important. So if we're thinking about the ability of past humans and even, like you say, humans that coexisted or predated Homo sapiens, it's very possible that cumulative culture and complex teaching techniques, at least the seeds of them, already coexisted when individuals were hunting with spears in the past. And that would mean it has so many ramifications, because it would
Yeah.
mean theory of mind, it would mean cooperation, it would mean, all these techniques of knowing your learners. At least some early instantiation of it would have had to be present for people to successfully hunt with spears.
It's easy for people from westernized cultures to study forager communities without humility about the skills that they have that we don't. I've never hunted with a spear, and certainly not for my own survival. And so I don't have any idea what I don't know about spear hunting. But Sheina and her colleagues do not make the mistake of assuming that people who live in societies that we consider to be simpler than our own also lack complex skills. And so they are among the first anthropologists to speculate and try to comprehend the significance of humans doing something very challenging and complex for hundreds of thousands of years. To Sheina and her colleagues, the Bayaka society is not an uneducated society. They are educated in different ways and for different complex skills, but they all play a role in a communal education system that works very well. As she said earlier, spear hunting knowledge is widely diffused throughout the community, which is interesting, considering that we in the West have pretty high rates of failure when it comes to transmitting the complex skills that we attempt to teach. What do Bayaka people think of our schools? And when I say our, I guess I'm referring to westernized culture, which I believe they have some interactions with, right?
Yeah.
I want to get a sense of what they feel about formal education versus, do they consider what they do to be education, or do they see it as something different?
So they definitely think of what they do as education. They have words for teaching, specifically bosesi mayele, to show knowledge. So it's very much based off of this like kind of interactive, demonstrative type of interaction. For sure, Bayaka kids have access to school and many do go. I think one thing that most kids would find it is a little bit boring compared to the varied kind of learning that they get to do and the self-initiated learning they get to do outside the classroom. I think most of them would say that classroom learning has some purpose, especially in terms of accessing market economies, but that it limits their ability to do other activities that they find equally important. And so one of the big missions of myself and very many of my colleagues, not only working with Bayaka, but working with hunter-gatherer communities more generally, is really actively thinking about how schools can be made to ensure that Bayaka have the tools that they need to advocate for their rights and to have a diversity of skill sets in terms of employment, but also that they can continue to do these practices that are very culturally important to them and that they can have a choice in the matter.
Yeah, I was a school principal and I was, scolding parents when they didn't have their kids there on time. And
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting, like the butts in the seat approach instead of measuring the actual learning, I think is a really big detriment to, especially to mobile communities who might spend a lot of the time away from school, especially in communities where parents themselves don't have enough schooling background to even be able to help their children with things like reading and homework and that type of thing. And where teachers are usually from another culture and might even hold some racist beliefs against these communities. So it's a lot of layers of complexity. But even so, some kids come out at the top of their class, do the exams, go on to advocate for their communities and do amazing things despite the challenges that they're faced with. And it's really amazing. And part of it is because they're self-initiated learners, the ones who are passionate about school, they just go for it and you can't hold them back. They have that initiative.
Are there some kids for whom it is not as good a match?
Yeah, for a lot of kids, people talk about having forest intelligence. Other kids have school intelligence. Many kids have both. But there are some kids for which it just doesn't work sitting in a classroom for long periods of time. A lot of times, at least in my experience, having never taught in a classroom, but having been a student, it often just reflects the type of input that kids are getting at home. And so if you have parents who have the time to spend hours reading you books and who have the resources to buy you like loads of complex books, then of course you'll rise to the top and you'll thrive in an academic environment. If you come from a household where there's other funds of knowledge, migrant kids, refugee kids, right? Kids who have all this lived experience and cultural competence, who are usually bilingual or at least bicultural, right? And who are able to do all these amazing things, but because it's not recognized in this really cookie cutter type of educational system, then we just say, oh, well, they don't have it. And for me, that's like the perfect intersection for the type of research that I do and the type of like school-based education that could happen in the world.
I just wanted to thank you again and also just say how glad I am that there are people who do this type of investigation work, building relationships with forager people across the world, expanding our view of what is possible, and taking the time to teach us about ourselves by looking at ourselves from a completely different perspective, I think.
Yeah, and I'm really grateful that there are educators like yourself, and I know there's so many educators actually that are so excited about thinking more broadly about what's possible. And so it's just a delight to be able to speak to you and to have my research, go beyond kind of the narrow set of people who are doing these like complex statistical models to think about what it could actually mean to improving, the experiences of kids from all over the world.
At the end of these interviews, I like to finish with my own 2 cents about what I think we have learned from the expert and how it informs the central question of this podcast, which is, what would it take to unleash our superpower? Teaching is something costly that we do so that someone else will learn. Anthropologists widely believe that teaching evolved in humans in order to transmit complex skills and knowledge so future generations could accomplish complex tasks. And what Sheina and her team demonstrated is something that seems obvious, and yet it's still incredibly profound. The more complex the skill is, the higher the cost of teaching. Another way of saying that is the price of complexity is the cost of education. This is a rule that is so fundamental that it has probably impacted the DNA that you have in each cell in your body right now. We invented a spear and figured out a good way to use it, but then we had to teach the kids how to do the same thing. Later, we found a way to extract metals from the ground and work with metal to make useful tools. But then we had to prepare a new generation of miners and blacksmiths. You invented the alphabet and a system for writing things down? That's great, but now we better invest more than ever in teaching future generations how to read and write. You invented machines that can do the work of 100 people? Okay, but now society itself just became more complex. We constantly find complex ways to solve problems. But those solutions always seem to complexify the world for future generations. The spear hunting pattern has been repeated over and over again in history. Economists are also aware of this phenomenon. They call it skill-biased technical change. The primary school movement of the 19th century could be seen through this lens as communities adapting to unprecedented levels of complexity by creating public schools for all kids in their communities. And that seemed to be good enough for a while, but then the world kept on complexifying. And so we created free and universal high schools in the next century. The 20th century education system, which is the one we still have today, also seemed good enough for a while. But now, since complexity has continued to rise, it's also out of date. Today, economists talk about how artificial intelligence, our expanding knowledge of healthcare, the interconnectedness of the globe are all solving technical problems and creating more complexity for future generations to learn. That's all just part of the same pattern that spear hunting is a part of. Raising complexity puts pressure on the education system, whatever that is. Computer skills, critical thinking skills, executive function skills, emotional intelligence, these are all widely considered to be growing in importance compared to when I was born, and most people worked in manufacturing. Complex skills have become more important just in my own little lifetime of 47 years. But the cost of education that we're willing to pay, that has not changed in my lifetime. In fact, it's gone down. When I was born, we spent 4.5% of all our money in public schools, and today we spend less than 4%. I think it's because the 20th century schooling system was such an incredible achievement that it caused us to see it as sort of like an end state, the final product. This schooling system is education. Coming up in these schools is what it means to be educated. And maybe because we think of it that way, we're trying out this completely new experiment, something Americans have never done before. What happens to our children and their children if we allow complexity to keep rising, but we don't pay more for their education? What happens when complexity rises, but the cost of education doesn't? This is where I honestly think that the Bayaka people can be an example to us. In this regard, I think they're more educationally advanced than we are, because they have not created complexity for their children and future generations that they're unwilling to prepare all their children for. Every young boy in their society needs to know how to spear hunt, and their communities are willing to use their superpower to teach every adolescent boy to make sure that they learn the complex skill of spear hunting. In other words, the complexity that they have created and rely on, and the educational cost that they're willing to pay for each child is perfectly in balance. And we cannot say that. When we in the West arrogantly destroy their way of life and force them into our more complex societies, we have to bear this in mind. We're taking them from a society in which the complexity and the communal costs of education are balanced to one where they're not. So what does any of this have to do with what it will take to unleash our superpower? Well, if we see complexity and the cost of education as being intertwined, and if we recognize that both of them have been rising together for hundreds of thousands of years, then I think it's obvious that it's not a question of if we will one day have to unleash our superpower. The only real question is when will we find the will to do it? In order to unleash our superpower, we may have to learn to see ourselves through this whole new lens that most of us just don't consider very much. I know I didn't. But any community that accepts the principle that the price of rising complexity is a rising cost of education may be willing to start looking for a way to unleash our superpower. And that's my 2 cents. Thanks for listening, and stay in touch.